Hello, hello. I'm very happy to have you all here. This is again EUROSTUDENT Talks, as you know, once in every month. At least we try so, and so far we have succeeded, luckily. Spring is arriving, and so do EUROSTUDENT 8 results of different countries. Today, we're going to talk about Norway. We will see very fresh EUROSTUDENT 8 results as well, and our special focus is on combining studying and paid work. Our speaker today is Anna-Lena Køyte. Anna-Lena works as a senior advisor at Statistics Norway and is a project leader for the EUROSTUDENT survey in Norway. She has been involved in the survey since EUROSTUDENT 6, so it means that EUROSTUDENT 8 is already her third round in the project. And besides the EUROSTUDENT survey, Anna-Lena works mainly on topics within upper secondary education and also lifelong learning. And among others, she is a member of the Norwegian team responsible for the PIAAC survey, which is a survey on adult skills. So this is about Anna-Lena, and I think it's already time to give the word to you. Very happy to welcome you here, and if you're ready, then we are already eager to hear your presentation and findings.
Thank you, Marlene, for this introduction, and thank you for inviting me to speak at these EUROSTUDENT Talks and to giving me the opportunity to present some Norwegian results. I will try to share the screen. I hope that it still works. So I hope that now you can see a presentation.
Yes, we can see.
Okay, great.
The presentation mode, we can see yet.
Okay, great. Now it seems to work. So, as Marlene said, I'm going to talk about how students in Norway combine studies and paid work, and I'm going to show some new results from the 8th round of EUROSTUDENT. Now we're waiting for the international results of EUROSTUDENT 8, but previous rounds of the survey have shown that Norway is one of the countries in the EUROSTUDENT context that has a very high share of students who work alongside their studies. And there are different explanations for this. On the one hand side, for those of you who don't know, Norway has a comparably old student population, and around 30% of the students in Norway are 30 years or older. And among the older students, it is very common that they consider themselves to be a worker rather than a student. But as we're going to see in the presentation, also for the full-time students in Norway and for the younger students, it is very common to work alongside their studies. But if students work quite a lot, they might have less time to spend on study-related activities. So it is very interesting to look at the trade-off between time they can spend on the studies and time spent on paid work. So how much time can students spend on paid work before we see that the time they can spend on the study-related activities is reduced? These are questions that we're going to see or to look at in this presentation. And the reason we wanted to do an analysis on the trade-off between studies and paid work is actually that in my first round of EUROSTUDENT 6, a colleague and I did a similar analysis. And this is the headline of an article that we published based on EUROSTUDENT 6 data. Too much time spent on paid work leads to reduction in study time. This is maybe not very surprising. And more specifically, what we found is that full-time students in Norway working more than 10 hours a week, they spend on average less time on the study-related activities compared to students who did not work at all. Before we turn to new results from EUROSTUDENT 8, I would like to tell you a little bit more about what we found 6 years earlier in EUROSTUDENT 6. So in EUROSTUDENT 6, conducted in 2016, we found that 1 in 3 full-time students in Norway had worked during the lecture period, either during the entire lecture period or working from time to time. We also saw that there were quite a lot of differences with regard to the time budget and how much time students spent on paid work and study-related activities when we looked into different groups. We saw that with regard to the time spent on study-related activities, students in long national degree spent most time on study-related activities. We also saw that there are quite a lot of differences, or were quite a lot of differences between different fields of study. What we saw, however, was that the overall workload combined time spent on studies and paid work was quite similar. So this implies that in 2016, we found some fields where the students on average spent less time on study-related activities, but in the same fields, the students on average spent also much more time on paid work alongside their studies. And then there were other fields where the situation was different. Students studied more, but also spent less time on paid work alongside the studies. So overall, the time budget was very comparable. So what we also saw was that students working 10 hours or more, they spend significantly less time on study-related activities compared to the non-working students. But what we also saw that working few hours a week, 1 to 10 hours, did not result in less study time. So in EUROSTUDENT 6, there seemed to be a trade-off around 10 hours. Working up to 10 hours a week didn't affect the study time, but working more than 10 hours a week led to a reduction in the time spent on study-related activities. And as much as 1 in 5 full-time students, 20% of the full-time students, worked more than these 10 hours a week. Of course, our results, and this is important to keep in mind, they only tell us something about how much time the students spend on work and study-related activities. And based on the results from this analysis done in 2016, we cannot conclude that students who work quite a lot alongside their studies perform worse than the non-working students, and we do not know anything about the consequences with regard to which grades they gain or whether they complete their studies to the same degree compared to the non-working students. And also, of course, it is important to keep in mind that working alongside their studies gives the students very important experience on the labor market, and often the work they have alongside their studies is also to a certain degree related to their studies. So this is very important to keep in mind, that it doesn't necessarily mean that all work has negative consequences with regard to the studies. A little bit more about the trade-off that we found in EUROSTUDENT 6, and it is illustrated in this figure. As I already mentioned, students who worked 1 to 5 or 6 to 10 hours a week didn't spend less time on the study-related activities compared to the students who did not work at all. And this is illustrated in the green line that shows us the amount of time spent on study-related activities in a normal week. And what we can see is that if students spend more than these 10 hours a week on study-related activity, on paid work, they spend less time on the study-related activities. If we break down the time spent on study-related activities in time spent on taught studies and personal studies, it is very interesting to see that already if students spend more than 10 hours a week on paid work, they spend less time on the personal study activities. But we also see that with regard to the taught study activities, up to the amount of 20 hours a week, if they work 20 hours a week, they seem to spend nearly as much time on taught studies as the non-working students. But however, if they work more than 20 hours a week, we see that also the time spent on taught study activities, of course, is reduced. So this is a short outline of what we saw some years earlier, but since EUROSTUDENT 6, a lot of time has passed, 6 years have passed, and there has been a pandemic in the meantime, and in Norway, and I guess also in a lot of the other countries, there is quite a lot of attention on the economic situation of the students. So what we're interested in seeing now is whether the trade-off between time spent on paid work and study time is the same in 2022 as we found in 2016. So let us have a look at the results from EUROSTUDENT 8. And before we turn to results, just some short information about how we conducted EUROSTUDENT 8 in Norway. In Norway, we have a total student population of around 280 students. From these students, we draw a sample of 24,000 students, and around 7,400 of the students responded to our survey. So we had a response rate of around 35%. I know that this is a high response rate in a EUROSTUDENT context, but actually we had even higher response rates in the previous rounds of EUROSTUDENT. All interviews and all data were collected using web questionnaires, and our survey period, the field period, was from the very end of April 2022 to the beginning of June 2022. In 2016, the share of working students in Norway was 42% of the students working during the entire lecture period, and another 25% of all students in Norway worked from time to time. So this implies that 1/3 of the students in Norway in 2016 did not have paid work alongside their studies. 6 years later, the picture looks like this. We see that the share of non-working students has decreased from 33% to 26%. And we see that it is also more common for students to work during the entire semester. The share has increased from 42% to 57% of the students working during the entire semester. So it is very important to keep in mind that when we compare the figures from 2016 and 2022, the numbers and the results are not 100% comparable. The target group of EUROSTUDENT 8 is a little bit different, and differently from 2026 in EUROSTUDENT 8, we also, and the other countries also included students in distance learning programs that were excluded in 2016. So students only being on distance learning and rarely being at the campus, they were not included in the 2016 figures. So one explanation can be, of course, that the students in distance learning programs, they have some more flexibility with regard to how they combine studies and paid work, and this can be one of the explanations why the share of working students in Norway has increased over the six-year period. And another explanation is that I already mentioned that Norway has a comparably old student population, but also the share of students being 30 years or older has increased over this 6-year period. So that can be another explanation, that a higher share of students 30 years or older also has an impact on how common it is for students to work in Norway, because among older students, nearly everyone works in Norway. So these are the figures for all students, but the analysis I already mentioned, they're from 2016, there we only focus on the full-time students. So let us have a look at how the situation is for the most common students in Norway, full-time students in bachelor degrees, master degrees, and long national degrees. If we look only at these students, we see that it is still quite common for the students to have paid work alongside their studies in 2022. And 47% of the full-time students work during the entire semester. Another 21% is working from time to time, and around 1/3 of the full-time students does not have any paid work during the lecture period. Compared to 6 years earlier, EUROSTUDENT 6, we see that the share of students working during the entire period has increased. And also 6 years ago, we had a lower share of students not working at all, around 40%. So we see that it is quite common for students in Norway to work, but how much do the students actually work? This figure illustrates how much time the full-time students spend on paid work during a week. As I already said, around 1/3 is not working at all. 11% work from 1 to 5 hours in a week, and 20% work 6 to 10 hours. So this implies that around 35% of the full-time students in Norway work more than 10 hours a week, but we see that working more than 20 hours a week isn't very common. Only 12% of the students in Norway work more than 20 hours a week. This figure illustrates not only how much time students spend on the paid work, but also how much time they spend on study-related activities on average. If we look at all full-time students in Norway, we see that they on average spend around 33 hours a week on study-related activities, and they spend another 10 hours a week on paid work. So this results in a total time budget of around 43 hours a week spent on study time and paid work. The average hours can, of course, be a little bit influenced by extreme values, and there are some students working quite a lot. So I also added the median numbers for time spent on paid work and study-related activities that also show and reflect that it is quite common for students in Norway to spend a lot of time on the study-related activities and paid work alongside the studies. In what follows, we are going to look only at the mean time spent on study-related activities and paid work, and we're now going to have a look at how the time budget varies for different groups of students. Let us start with students in different age groups. This figure shows how much time the students in different age groups spend on study-related activities and paid work during a week. What we see is that for the youngest students, they spend least time both on study-related activities and on paid work, 32 hours on average on study-related activities and 7 hours a week on paid work. So even the youngest students in Norway, when we combine the time they spend on studies and paid work, have a total workload of nearly 40 hours a week. If we look at the other age groups, we see that the total time budget for these groups is a little bit bigger compared to the youngest students. But what is very interesting to see is that the time the students in the age groups 22 to 24, 25 to 29, and 30 years old or older spent on study-related activities is very similar. The time they spend on study-related activities is on average 33 to 34 hours. But what makes the difference is that the older the students are, the more time they spend on paid work on average. And a reason why we see this distribution and this pattern is that the older the students are, the more common it is also for them to have paid work and also to work a lot. Next, we go on with having a look at gender differences in the time budget. We see that the female students on average both study a little bit more, and they also on average spend a little bit more time on paid work during a week. But both with regard to study-related activities and time spent on paid work, we don't see the big differences. So the total time budget of female and male students is very similar. Next, we're going to have a look at the time budget for students studying for different qualifications. And we see that students in bachelor programs, they spend on average least time on study-related activities with 32 hours. This is a little bit higher in master programs and long national degrees, where students on average spend 35 to 36 hours a week on study-related activities. What we also can see on this figure is that students in master's degree, they tend to work most, and they spend on average 12 hours a week on paid work alongside their studies. And the patterns that we see here reflect to a certain degree also the age differences that we have already seen, because students in bachelor programs, they are normally a little bit younger compared to the students in master programs. So there might be a little correlation also between age and which program they are studying for. In Norway, it is very common for students not to live with their parents, and only 1 in 10 full-time students in Norway live at home with their parents. It's also very interesting to see whether the students' time budget varies by their form of housing. And we actually see that students not living with their parents, they spend on average a little bit more time on paid work and a little bit less time on study-related activities compared to the students that live at home with their parents. However, again, the differences are not very big. Finally, we're going to have a look at the time budget for students in different fields of studies. And we start with the fields of education, humanities, social sciences, and business administration and law. What we can see for these fields of study is that students on average don't spend a lot of time on study-related activities, 28 hours on average in the field of education and teacher training, and up to 32 hours a week in the field of business administration and law. However, for students in these 4 fields, it is very common to spend a lot of time on paid work alongside their studies. And students in these fields work on average from 9 hours in social science to 12 hours in the field of business administration and law and in the field of education. Next, we turn to the fields of natural sciences, ICTs, and engineering, where we see that the picture is quite a little bit different. In these fields of study, it is more common for the students to spend more time on the study-related activities, 36 hours in ICTs, up to 41 hours in engineering in a normal week. But what we also can see is that the students in these three fields of study, they work less compared to students in, for example, education or business administration and law. And students in natural sciences, ICTs, and engineering, they work around 6 hours a week on average. So what we can see until now is that even if the distribution of time spent on studies and paid work alongside the studies is quite different for the different fields, the total workload of studies and paid work is quite similar for the different fields. Lastly, we will have a look at the fields of health and medicine that again are a little bit different. For students in health, it is common both to work a lot and to study a lot. They study on average 35 hours a week. And again, they also spend around 11 hours on average on paid work alongside the studies. Student in medicine, they are special because they spend quite a lot of time on the study-related activities, 44 hours a week, but they also work on average 7 hours a week. So this results in quite a high time budget for students in this field of study. And I guess that this is the case not only in Norway, but that also in a lot of other countries. Students in this field in the field of medicine spend quite a lot of time on the study-related activities. So what we have seen until now is that the time budget of the students varies when we compare different groups of students. But what is the effect of time spent on paid work alongside the studies on the study time if we take into account these differences? And how does time spent on paid work affect spend time on study-related activities if we take into account that the time budget varies between the groups, different students in different age groups or students in different fields of study? This is what we're going to look at next in this presentation. And in order to have a look at these questions, we are going to see at results from linear regression models. I suppose that a lot of those who are attending the EUROSTUDENT Talks today are familiar with the method of regression models. If not, I can say a little bit about this method. And in short, it is a method that makes it possible for us to look at the variation in one dependent variable, and in our case, that is time spent on study-related activities, and to see how different explanatory variables have an impact on this, on the time spent on study-related activities. So in our case, we're going to look at the effect of time spent on paid work, but we also include a lot of other variables in our model, so we can say something about the effect of the time spent on paid work has on the study-related activities when we take into account that we also have control for age differences, field of study, and so on. So let us turn to the results. And we start with a very simple model, with a very simple regression model where we only use gender, qualification studied for, whether students live with parents, whether the parents have higher education, we use age, and we also use time spent on paid work as an explanatory variable. The intercept says something about the average time spent on paid on study-related activities if all the explanatory variables are 0. So in our case, that would be the time that a student who is a male student studying for a bachelor degree, living with his parents, the parents have not higher education, the student is between 22 and 24 years old, and doesn't spend any time on paid work alongside the studies. This student would spend around 34 hours a week on study-related activities. What we can see from the regression model is that female students on average spend more time on study-related activities compared to the male students. And we also see that there are statistically significant differences between students studying for different qualifications. Students in master's degrees spend on average 2 hours more on study-related activities compared to students in a bachelor degree. And those studying for a long national degree, they spend even more time, around 3 hours more on average, on study-related activities compared to the bachelor students. We also see that there is a statistically significant difference between students living and not living with parents, but those not living with parents spend on average a little bit less time on study-related activities. In Norway, and I guess that is also the case for a lot of other countries, we see that parents' educational attainment has a lot of impact on the children's educational attainment and educational career. So we also included parents' educational attainment as an explanatory variable, but we can see that with regard to the time spent on study-related activities, we cannot find any differences between students whose parents have higher education and students whose parents do not have higher educational attainment. What we can see, on the other hand, is that the age differences that we saw on one of the figures I showed you are statistically significant. When we compare students that are younger than 22 years to those who are in the age group of 22 to 24 years, we see that the youngest students on average spend less time on the study-related activities, but we also see that compared to the age group 22 to 24 years, those who are in the age group 25 to 29 years or 30 years or older spend more time on study-related activities. Lastly, and this is maybe the thing that we are most interested in, we are looking at the effect of time spent on paid work. And the results from the regression model show us that for each time spent on paid work, a student spends on average minus 0.2 or minus 0.3 hours less on study-related activities. So this is nearly 20 minutes less for each hour spent on paid work. So if a student worked 3 hours a week, the students would spend around 1 hour less on study-related activities compared to non-working students. And of course, the more time the students spend on paid work, the less time they spend on study-related activities. And we also see that this difference is statistically significant, so we can conclude that time spent on paid work has an effect on the time the students spend on study-related activities. However, we also saw that there are quite a lot of differences between students enrolled in different fields of study. So in the next model, I will also show you something about the effect of field of study. The first model that we're seeing here is the model I just presented to make it easier to compare the two models. And when we introduce field of study as another explanatory variable, we see that with regard to the coefficients for the other variables, there are not quite a lot of changes. However, one thing that is interesting is that if we also introduce field of study, we see that the effect or the gender differences have increased. And controlling also for field of study, we see that female students spend on average nearly 3 hours more on study-related activities compared to the male students. We'll still find the same differences between students in different qualifications. And we also see that age still has an effect, even if we control for the field of study. When we look at the effect of time spent on paid work, we also see that the results are quite similar. The coefficient has reduced a little bit, but still we find that for each hour spent on paid work, a student spends less time on study-related activities. Next, I want to say something about the effect of the field of study, and our results confirm that there are statistically significant differences between students enrolled in different fields of study. We see that students in education on average spend nearly 6 hours less on study-related activities compared to the students in business, administration and law, which is the reference category in our case. And we also see that the same is true for students in social sciences. They also spend on average less time on study-related activities compared to students in business, administration and law. And these differences are statistically significant. With regard to students in social sciences, pharmacy and welfare, humanities, and some of the other fields of study, we cannot conclude that there are statistically significant differences in the time they spend on study-related activities, taking into account that we also control for other variables such as gender, qualification, and so on. But what we see is that with regard to the other fields, health, natural sciences, and ICTs, we see that students in these fields on average spend statistically significantly more time on study-related activities compared to the students in business, administration, and law. And this is also true for the fields of engineering and medicine, where students on average spend 8 and 9 hours more on the study-related activities compared to the students who are enrolled in business, administration, and law. So this confirms the figures that we saw on one of the previous slides, and confirms that at least for some fields of study, the differences in the time they spend on study-related activities are also statistically significant when we control for other variables. Lastly, I will show you a new or another regression model that is a little bit different, because until now we have looked at time spent on paid work as a continuous variable. So until now we have seen that for each hour spent on paid work, the students spend so and so much time less on study-related activities. In this regression model, we want to have a closer look at where is the trade-off between time spent on study-related activities and paid work, and up to how many hours can students work before we see a significant decrease in the time they spend on study-related activities. I'm not going to focus so much on the other figures that are included in this or the other coefficients in this model, and will mainly focus on the time spent on paid work. But you can see that for all the other experimental variables, whether we introduce time spent on paid work in categories or as a continuous variable, doesn't have an impact on the other patterns that we find. So we still find, for instance, the differences between different qualifications studied for, or the differences between the fields of studies that I just showed you. But now let's turn to the effect of time spent on paid work when we look at time spent on paid work in different categories. If we compare students who do not work at all to students working 1 to 5 hours a week, we actually see that the students working 1 to 5 hours a week, they spend a little bit less, nearly 2 hours less on study-related activities compared to the non-working students. On the other hand, we see that those working 6 to 10 hours a week, they don't have any differences with regard to the study-related activities and how much time they spend on the studies compared to the non-working students. We're wondering a little bit why we find that students working a little bit have a somewhat lower time budget spent on study-related activities compared to the non-working students. But it seems that these results confirm that up to the amount of 10 hours a week, it doesn't really, working doesn't really affect how much time the students spend on their studies. But what is more obvious is that students working 11 to 15 hours a week, or even 16 to 20 hours a week, they spend significantly less time on the study-related activities compared to the non-working students. It is interesting to have a closer look at the coefficients also in this case, because we see that whether students work 11 to 15 hours or 16 to 20 hours doesn't make a big impact with regard to how much time they spend less on the study-related activities. And it seems that both groups of students spend around 2 hours less on study-related activities compared to the non-working students. And also, and this is not very surprising, students working 21 to 25 or 26 to 30 or even more than 30 hours a week, they work significantly, or they spend significantly less time on the study-related activities compared to the non-working students. So the more the students work alongside the studies, the less time they can spend on study-related activities. But it seems that there still is a certain trade-off at around 10 hours a week spent on paid work. So to sum up a little bit the results that I show you, is so that in 2022, it is even more common for the full-time students in Norway to have paid work alongside the study compared to what the situation was like 6 years earlier in 2016. And we also still find that the time budget and how much time students spend on study-related activities and paid work varies between different groups of students. We still find that students working more than 10 hours a week, they spend less time on study-related activities compared to the students who do not work at all. And in EUROSTUDENT 8, we see that around 35% of the full-time students, an even higher share compared to earlier rounds of EUROSTUDENTs, work more than 10 hours a week and therefore are in the risk of spending less time on study-related activities. But again, it is very important to keep in mind that also the jobs they have alongside their studies can be very relevant for the studies they have, and that this doesn't necessarily mean that the students spending more time on the study or more time on paid work perform worse compared to the non-working students. Today I showed you the results from EUROSTUDENT 8 for Norway, but we are planning to extend this analysis. I saw that some of the Nordic colleagues are also attending this webinar, and we have already been in contact with them and asked them to do the same or to run the same regression models to see whether the patterns that we find in Norway are comparable to results from the other Nordic countries, or whether we can find that the trade-off between paid work and studying looks differently in Norway compared to Sweden, Finland, Denmark, and Iceland. So we hope that at the final conference in Vienna, we can present some insights from a Nordic analysis on this topic. That's what I wanted to show you today, and I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Anna-Lena. It was really, really interesting looking into Norwegian students' lives, especially working and studying. Any questions from our audience or any comments, or maybe someone wants to share their view about their country and the situation? You can put your question to the chat, but you can also let us know by raising your hand and I can give you the word. I will give you a bit time. Yeah, Auna, raised hand, please, feel free.
From the University of Tartu, Estonia, or the working of students, it's considered a huge topic here in Estonia because, yeah, we have, I think, one of the highest numbers in Europe of the working students. But I just wanted to thank you for the presentation and just really giving a very comprehensive overview. I wanted to hear about the evaluation. What is the understanding in the society? Is a student working a problem? Is it something that is inevitable? That is, because of the labor market situation, is it just a problem for the universities and everybody else is considering something that's as a normal? Just a little bit for the background is, for example, in Estonia, it seems to me, and for the university, it's a problem, but for the rest of the society, it seemed to me that everybody has accepted that master students work. It's something that is, you got a bachelor degree and you want to move out of the home, and because of the rather low benefits or student scholarships, it's considered somehow normal, and it's very difficult to fight on the university side with this kind of attitude or understanding. And yeah, just wanted a little reflection about the evaluation of the society to this situation that you have.
Yeah, very interesting question that you're asking. Well, in Norway, I don't know how familiar all of you are with the economic situation of students in Norway, but in Norway, and in contrast to a lot of the other countries participating in EUROSTUDENT, it is very common for students to get financial support from the state to finance their studies. But there has also been some kind of discussion the past years that the state support isn't sufficient for the students, and that this is one of the reasons why they also have to work. And in Norway, we also, when we look at the reasons why the students have paid work alongside their studies, we also see that it is very common for them to say that they work to cover their living costs, or to buy things they otherwise wouldn't be able to buy. But of course, on the other hand, there's also this dimension of the importance of having some experience on the labor market before you apply for a job and have finished your studies. So I think it's a very complex question, actually, and a very complex situation.
Thank you. Thank you, Auna, for asking, and thanks, Anna-Lena. There is a question in the chat as well from Rita that, do you have any insights into the hourly wages or into the level of qualification required for the lower tiers? Let's say up to 10 hours. A few hours of tutoring and several days of the week might pay more than 8-hour shift at coffee shop, for example.
We don't have any information on this, unfortunately. I think we might maybe have to look into other types of data, because data from EUROSTUDENT do not give us any insights into where the students are working. We know whether the job they have is related to the studies or not, but we don't know if they do tutoring or if they work at a coffee shop. So unfortunately, I don't have any information on this.
It was actually one thing that I was wondering, that there is the question, as you mentioned, that are students working on a similar close profession related to their study program, that what are these numbers showing about Norway?
Well, in Norway, for around 60% of the full-time students, we see that the job they have is related closely or very closely to what they're studying. But of course, there are also some differences between different fields of study. And in some fields, it is easier to find a job that is related compared to other fields.
But still quite a good number, at least, seems so.
Yeah, I think that 60% seems to be quite high. I don't know how it is for the other countries, but I think that more than half of the students have a job that is relevant. So I think that's a high number.
Any other questions or comments? Anything else you would like to know about Norwegian context? Yeah, Auna again, please.
Yeah, sorry, I hope I'm not taking anybody's floor, but just to clarify, all the slides you showed was about these full-time students, and I understand these numbers would be different if we would include the part-time or students. What is the percentage of full-time students of all students? Is it like a big majority?
Yeah, well, I don't know the exact number of part-time students, but I think it is around and a little bit less than 20% of the students in Norway. And the older the students are, the more common it is for them to consider themselves to be a part-time student and not a full-time student. And in EUROSTUDENT, there's also a question whether the students consider themselves to be a worker or a student primarily. And for all students, around 35%, I think, of the students are primarily a worker studying a little bit. But when we look only at the full-time students, the number or the share is much lower, and only around 10% of the full-time students say that they are primarily a worker and not a student. So this is why I wanted to exclude the part-time students in order to make it easier to say something about the time budget of a normal student in Norway.
If I can just more comment, it would be interesting to make a next step. It was really interesting, the analysis to show that how much the working hours differed and what is the factors predicting the working hours. It would be interesting to connect not the working hours, but the study hours. It would be interesting to make a next step to see how much the study hours are related to the grades or the success of the studies.
Yeah.
So if we would like to have more study hours, of course, from the university point of view, then it would be good to see. And just another comment from our side, we just yesterday got a fresh analysis of comparing the the working habits, or let's say the working hours, and of the local and international students in Estonia, and of the graduates, local and international graduates who stay in Estonia. And it's interesting that the international students are working less compared to local students. I don't know whether it's the same in Norway, or you haven't done this kind of comparison.
We didn't have a look into this in the analysis I just showed you. But I think that earlier we also looked a little bit into this and found that also among the international students, it is quite common that they have work alongside their studies. But I don't know the exact numbers.
So many interesting angles to dive into more as well. Actually, I was wondering, you mentioned that you have quite high response rate in the survey, and also during previous EUROSTUDENT talks, we have talked about the topic, and it is often a challenge that the response rate is not very high. So how have you in Norway achieved this quite high number?
A good question. Well, I think compared to Switzerland, they have an even higher response rate. Our response rate is not that impressive, but I know that a lot of the other countries are struggling with getting high response rates. And especially students, they are a group that get a lot of surveys and are asked to participate in this and that survey, yeah, like Euro students and national student surveys. So there is it is an issue that students are a group that is over-surveyed, and they are very difficult to reach. But what we do in Norway, we have very good information about, we have very good contact information about the students. We have a central register in Norway about telephone numbers and email addresses that are used in the communication with the authorities in Norway, and this, of course, makes it easier for us compared to other countries to get in touch with the students, because having good contact information is very important to even reach the students. If we have email addresses that they don't use, they will never see that they were invited to participate in EUROSTUDENT. And another thing that we do, those of you who have seen me talking at other EUROSTUDENT conference might have heard that we use quite a lot of reminders to make the students participate. And in EUROSTUDENT 8, our field phase was more than a month, quite long actually for Norway, but we saw that it helped a little bit to have the questionnaire open for some more weeks to get even more responses. But in EUROSTUDENT 6 and EUROSTUDENT 7, our field phase was only 2 weeks. And during these 2 weeks, we send out quite a lot of reminders, because we see that the more reminders the students get, the easier it is to make them participate in the survey. And I think that another thing that we have done during the past years is to work actively on adapting the questionnaire to the use on mobile devices, because in Norway it is very common that when you get the email and you're asked to participate, you try to open it on your smartphone, and this of course makes it also very important that the questions are easy to answer on a mobile device. So I think these are just some reflections on why we might have a higher response rates compared to other countries. But of course, there can also be a lot of other factors and that explain the differences.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's quite different, the situation among countries, whether they have the contact lists of students and so on, because many also refer to the fact that they don't. And it's said that it's about data privacy and so on, that you even can't have it maybe. So it means that you can only contact those students through the higher education institutions. And the more steps you have in between, the more difficult it will be, I can assume. Yeah, anything else? Any other comments or questions that have popped up in your heads and you would like to ask or share with us? maybe some of our Nordic colleagues would like to comment or elaborate as well. I think it would be very interesting to see the countries in comparison. And as Aune mentioned, in Estonia, it is also very common for students to work. So maybe once the Nordic analysis is ready, it would be also interesting to compare that to the situation in Estonia. I was also wondering that you compared this 2016 situation and now the fresh results. Were you surprised by the findings or the numbers?
Well, not really. I think that it's not very surprising that the results are quite similar. But on the other hand, it is also to keep in mind that the data are not 100% comparable. And what is also very good about the Eurostudent aid data is that actually we have better information, for instance, on the field of study. We have more detailed information and are able to have a non-category for medicine students and previously they were in the field of health together with a lot of other students, even though their time budget, as we saw, is a little bit different. So I cannot really say that I'm really surprised, but of course it is very interesting to see how the situation has developed and how the more detailed data can help us improve the analysis that we are doing.
And indeed, on one hand, at least what we have seen also during previous Eurostudent talks, that many students lost their jobs during the pandemic, but after that, when the inflation was really like getting higher and higher in many countries in Europe, actually it is logical that they at least try to work more because the living costs are higher as well. So yeah, but I think I don't have any other questions, but maybe someone else still does. So this is the last chance before we wrap it up. Yeah, we can see that Swedish colleagues are also looking forward for the comparative view. Indeed, we all do. Maybe this is also something that we can discuss at some point, either at the Eurostudent Final Conference, which actually takes place already in July in Vienna. So you can all look it up from the Eurostudent webpage, and maybe we can all meet there. But then I think it's time to wrap it up. It was really interesting insight into the Norway situation and how the students are living and studying and working there. Many thanks to you, Anna-Lena, for the presentation, and also many thanks to all our listeners. Always very thankful that you are here. We will see again in April at next Eurostudent Talks. Very likely it will be the mid-April, around 18th, but the information will come as usually via Twitter and via mailing list, so stay tuned and we will see everybody again. Thanks everyone and have a nice day.